What is the chemistry like with that team right now? We know there's been, issues in the past with DA and the contract business that wasn't smooth, to put it lightly. Where do you think they stand right now?
Suns currently sit seventh within the Western Conference as of this recording of this podcast. Where are you in terms of how they performed this season?
Yeah, I think you look at their overall record and their place in the West, and the natural inclination is to be a little disappointed. This is a team that won 64 games last year and honestly should have won a title. They honestly beat themselves more than the Mavs did in that second round series. It was really uncharacteristic and kind of hard to watch. But um, injuries have played a huge part in that as well this season. Like there's no beating around the bush on that. They've had guys in roles that they wouldn't have imagined. They've missed, Chris Paul missed a month with a sore right heel and then missed another 2 weeks with right hip soreness. Devin Booker has been out since Christmas with the groin strain. Cam Payne and Landry Shamet have been banged up off and on all season. DA's missed time. Crowder never has even showed up. And then that's leaving out Cam Johnson's major knee surgery that caused him to miss 37 games. So this team really hasn't had a chance to see what their starting lineup looks like a ton. And I think in 67 minutes together with their preferred starting lineup of Chris Paul, Devin Booker, Mikal Bridges, Cam Johnson, and DA, they've got a plus 33 net rating, which is pretty good. And they were first in the West before injuries started to kind of take over, and they hit a little bit of a slump there when they had a tough schedule. I think they played Pelicans, Rockets, and Celtics in the span of a week. So I do think this team is still very good once they get healthy. I think they do need to make some moves on the fringes at the trade deadline to kind of bolster their chances. But if they can get Devin Booker back here soon and just kind of tread water until then, you look at the standings, there's really not a ton of separation outside of maybe the top two teams and the rest of the pack. So they could definitely make up some ground and mess around and get home court advantage before all is said and done.
Still seems like things pretty calm in Phoenix. What's your sense of panic maybe within the organization or otherwise what you're seeing on social media?
Yeah, I mean, the team itself is not panicking. They've always kind of held to the firm belief, like, look, we're going to be okay once we get our guys back. And I think they're right to do so. Like they proved last year that they're capable of stringing together wins pretty quickly. The fan base has not been as optimistic. This is a fan base that watched this team win 64 wins last year and completely trip over themselves in a game 7 at home against a Mavs team that I think heading into the playoffs they had beaten something like 7 or 9 straight times. So it's a little less optimistic on that front. There has been a lot of criticism as far as DA's defense, Mikal Bridges not stepping up when they had guys injured, Cam Johnson, his durability. I'm not in that same boat by any stretch. I think if you look at the standings, like the Suns put together multiple win streaks last season. They could win 5 games in a row and be, back in 4th in the West, just like that. Like it really is a matter of kind of taking the hits as they come as far as the injuries are concerned. And once they get Booker back, I mean, he was carrying too heavy of a load, but the hope is that with the extra duties that Mikal and DA have had to take on in his absence, it'll make this team a little bit more complete, a little bit tougher to defend in the playoffs, so that he's not having to carry an immense load, which he was to start the season. He was playing at a borderline MVP level, which is great, but they were having him do way too much. And I think now the hope is that once he comes back, they'll be a little bit more balanced and can make a run.
Gerald, can you take us into the Suns fan base? You mentioned how they're becoming very impatient, but can you kind of give us a snapshot in terms of the Robert Sarver era compared to the Matt Ishbia era?
Yeah, I think fans are definitely optimistic, and we don't know a ton about Ishbia yet because he hasn't officially taken over. But based on what we've read and heard about him, listened to his appearances on podcasts, just trying to glean whatever information we can. He seems like he has good values that would kind of mesh very well with the same sort of culture that Monty Williams and James Jones have tried to build here. I don't know what that says about their future here. I think Monty is fine. James Jones, we'll see. A lot of times when owners come in, they like to bring in their own guys. So we'll see what that amounts to, but he does seem to run his company with the family values that he was raised on. Obviously, he was a former basketball player himself, which can either be a good thing because he understands the landscape and he has people that he can relate to, or it could be a bad thing if he thinks he knows too much and meddles a little bit too much and doesn't trust people to do their job. So we'll see, but there's definitely a ton of optimism because he is investing a ton in this franchise. And looking at this team's cap sheet going into next season, there's a 0% chance that they're not going to be headed for luxury tax territory again. So you want an owner that's going to invest in the community, that's going to invest in the team, be willing to make those payments, be committed to winning a championship. Obviously, he's a little bit younger, so he gets the game a little bit more. And then there's the obvious thing of he's not Robert Sarver. He's not a stain or a blemish on the franchise's reputation. Reading the investigative findings, I know a lot of people that worked for the organization for multiple years. I know people that work there still now. And it was a miserable work environment. It was a toxic place. So just by getting an owner that, maybe doesn't do things like drop the N-word or, sexually harass employees or whatever you want to call it, like that's a step up just by itself.
Yeah, right.
So there's a ton of optimism for Ishbia in terms of the competitiveness, but just as a base level, hopefully he'll treat people like human beings, and that's a great start.
And it seems like Ishbia is walking into or buying into a great situation with what the Suns have, at least in terms of like Bridges, Booker, and DA as kind of this like cornerstone you can build on. When you look at where the Suns are headed, what is the chemistry like with that team right now? We know there's been, issues in the past with DA and the contract business that wasn't smooth, to put it lightly. Where do you think they stand right now?
Yeah, I think it's in a good place. It's been better. Obviously, last year when you're rolling through the league and beating everybody, it's going to be at an all-time high.
Sure.
This season was difficult, and they got off to a 5-1 start to their credit before, guys started going injured. But it's tough when you look at the summer. Just the way that they went out in that playoff series would have been tough enough, but then you compound it with the DA contract situation, with the Jay Crowder holdout heading into training camp, with all the Kevin Durant rumors that pretty much put everybody's name except for Devin Booker and Chris Paul on the trade block at various points. Like there was a lot of things that probably should have been hashed out over the summer and maybe weren't. And these guys love each other. Like Mikal Bridges and Cam Johnson, they call each other twins, and DA, they call him their triplet. Like a lot of guys that come in here rave about the culture, the work ethic of these guys, the camaraderie. But it can be demanded when you have your point guard is Chris Paul, a guy who historically expects a lot from his players, especially big men. When you have a guy like Devin Booker, who's the ultimate competitor and often acts the same way. And when you've got a guy like DA who, let's be frank, he's a fun-loving personality, but he's maybe not always as focused or laser locked in as some of these other guys are. And those type of things can clash every now and then. I'm sure DA is not oblivious to a lot of the criticism he gets from the fan base for, the step he's taken backward on the defensive end, the inconsistency in his performances. It's been something that's come up for years now, and you would hope in year 5 for a number 1 overall pick that some of those issues would have been ironed out by now. But I do think he does want to be here. Whether he, wouldn't be happier somewhere else, I can't say. I think he's happy here now as long as the team is winning, and that's hopefully what they're going to start doing. And that, winning cures everything. If this team comes through and wins a title, all this other stuff is going to be blown by the wayside. But for now, especially over the last month when you're dealing with some losing streaks, that kind of stuff can come to the forefront. And to their credit, they never kind of had those moments where it felt like, oh, shoot, like this team needs to be broken up or somebody's got to go.
So one more question on that. Is there a breaking point, or do you think loyalty will win out? Just in the case of like Dirk and Dallas, where it seems like there was a huge loyalty to him and eventually he did win the title. Do you see that situation playing out?
Well, I'm glad you brought up that example, because the key difference there is obviously Dirk was the face of the franchise. Sure. And here in Phoenix, DA is not that guy. He's a beloved guy, especially as a U of A alum and kind of a hometown kid. But, I do wonder what the breaking point might be, because the way that it's gone, I think the Suns are fine as long as they're winning. But guess what? Once you get to the playoffs, only one team wins it all. So at some point, someone's going home disappointed. And for a team that has title aspirations, if it's the Suns that goes home at any point during the playoffs, you have to wonder, unless it's the finals, you have to wonder, okay, are we getting close to a breaking point? Because a lot of times when the Suns get beat, it's not DA's fault, but there's a definite difference between their success and their failures based on how locked in he is. So I do think if there is a playoff series, especially like last year where they start off great the first 2 games, they go up 2-0, and then they lose 4 of the next 5 to lose a series. If something like that happens again, especially if it's as early in the playoffs as it was last year, I do think there's a possibility that tempers flare up. Like I don't think we'll ever see a game quite like that Game 7 again, especially on their home floor. But something like that isn't out of the questions if the Suns fall short of expectations, especially if DA is the one that is not picking up the slack. Because right now, and we've seen this for the last 2 years, regular season kind of inconsistent. He's mostly been able to turn it on in the playoffs. If he doesn't do that and the Suns go home because of it, I do think there's a possibility that all of the external pressure, all of the outside narratives, all of that kind of builds up into something that words are said that maybe can't be taken back. And maybe at that point, the Suns do consider trading DA for that number 2 superstar alongside Book. Because the Suns have always kind of held the belief, looking around the league, like the Warriors won last year starting Kevon Looney at center. You don't need an elite center. Obviously, you'd love to have a Jokic or an Embiid, but most teams don't have that guy, and a lot of the teams that have won titles recently don't need that guy. So rather than devoting max money to a center who doesn't really create much of his own offense and has been kind of disengaged at times on defense, I do think if this season goes south and he's part of the reason why, they could look to move him in the offseason, and he might, his trade veto privileges come up. They end after a year from his signing. So it's a possibility for sure.